The train screeched to a stop in Cheyenne, Wyoming, hissing steam and spitting dust. Passengers spilled onto the platform, a river of weary bodies flowing toward warm embraces and waiting wagons. But one woman stood alone. Her name was Eliza Hart. She was 27 years old. She'd traveled 1,000 miles with a letter in her pocket and a promise in her heart. The letter was from a man named James McKinnon. He was supposed to be her husband, but as the crowd thinned and the dust settled, a cold truth began to creep in. No one called her name. No one searched for her face. She had been abandoned. The western sun beat down on her shoulders. The wind whispered empty promises. An hour crawled by, and the platform was a ghost town. Eliza clutched her small satchel, her knuckles white. A hot wave of shame washed over her. Was she so unwanted that even a stranger who'd paid for her passage had changed his mind? Just as despair began to tighten its icy grip, a small voice cut through the silence. "Ma'am, are you lost?" Eliza turned. A little girl, no older than 6, stood before her in a simple blue dress. Her blonde braids were uneven, and her eyes were the impossible blue of a mountain sky. Before Eliza could find her voice, the girl whispered words that shattered the silence. "Can you be my mommy?" The question stole the air from Eliza's lungs. She looked around, expecting to see a mother rushing forward, scolding, apologizing. Instead, a tall man approached. His boots were heavy on the wooden planks. He wore the trail on his clothes and a profound grief in his eyes. "That's enough, Annie," the man said. His voice was gentle, but it was anchored by a deep, immovable pain. He placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. The girl, Annie, looked up at him. "Papa, she looks like she belongs with us." The man's jaw tightened. He took off his hat, his eyes meeting Eliza's. "Ma'am, I apologize for my daughter. She lost her mother last year. Sometimes she doesn't understand." Eliza, still reeling, knelt to look Annie in the eye. "You're very sweet," she said, her voice a near whisper. "But I'm not sure I belong anywhere." The man cleared his throat. "Name's Thomas Hale. My daughter can be forward." "Eliza Hart," she replied, managing a faint smile. Thomas Hale's eyes flickered to her single satchel, then back to the empty platform. "Waiting on someone?" Eliza swallowed the lump in her throat. "I was. It seems plans have changed." Something in her voice, a note of shattered hope, seemed to reach him. His expression softened. "This country's hard on those without kin," he said, his voice cautious. "If you've nowhere to go, my sister keeps house. And Annie, well, she could use a woman's kindness around." The offer was a lifeline in a merciless sea, but it was also a risk. A stranger's kindness in this land could be a mask for something far more dangerous. But the thought of wandering alone with no money and no hope was a worse kind of danger. And the way Annie's small hand had found her skirt, clinging with an innocent, desperate hope, that was a plea she couldn't ignore. That night, Eliza lay awake on a cot in the Hale Ranch house, listening to the lonely cry of coyotes. She was 1,000 miles from everything she'd ever known, her future a blank, terrifying page. The little girl's question echoed in the darkness. "Can you be my mommy?" She didn't know it yet, but that question was not a child's fantasy. It was a premonition, and it would lead her down a path of secrets, lies, and murder. The first days at the Hale Ranch were a blur of hard work and quiet tension. Eliza's hands, soft from a life of books and sewing, were soon raw with blisters from fetching water and kneading dough. There was Thomas's sister, Margaret, a woman with watchful eyes and a silence that felt like judgment. She moved through the house with a quiet efficiency, offering Eliza food and shelter, but not a single ounce of warmth. Then there was Annie. The little girl was a sunbeam in a house shrouded by grief. She followed Eliza everywhere, her constant questions a balm on Eliza's wounded spirit. "Why is your hair red? Can you sing like Mama did? Will you stay forever?" Eliza answered each question carefully, keenly aware of the invisible lines she was not supposed to cross. Thomas remained a ghost in his own home. He spoke in clipped sentences, his eyes always distant, lost in a memory Eliza couldn't see. Grief was a wall around him, high and cold. He was a man drowning in his own silence. But something was wrong. It wasn't just grief that haunted Thomas Hale. It was fear. Eliza saw it in the way he checked the locks at night, the way he kept a rifle propped by the door, the way his hand would drift to the pistol on his hip whenever a rider approached the ranch. This family wasn't just grieving. They were hiding. One afternoon, Annie fell ill. A fever came on fast, her skin burning, her breath coming in shallow gas. Panic seized the house. Margaret wrung her hands and prayed. Thomas paced the floor like a caged animal, but Eliza felt a strange calm settle over her. Years ago, her grandmother had taught her the old ways, the language of herbs and roots. She found willow bark by the creek to brew a tea. She crushed yarrow leaves into a poultice. She sat by Annie's bed all night, bathing her forehead and whispering stories. Thomas stood in the doorway watching her. His face was a mask of fear and a desperate, fragile hope. By dawn, the fever broke. Annie stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at Eliza, and a weak smile touched her lips. "Mama Liza," she whispered, before drifting back into a peaceful sleep. The name hung in the air, a fragile, impossible thing. Tears pricked Eliza's eyes. Thomas stepped into the room. His voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "You saved her." "I only remembered what I was taught," Eliza said, her voice shaking. He took a step closer. The wall of grief around him seemed to crack. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. "My wife, Sarah, she died of a fever just like this. It came on so fast. The doctor said there was nothing to be done." A cold dread trickled down Eliza's spine. "When?" "Last fall," he said, his gaze turning inward again. "She was out riding, checking a fence line near the old McKinnon place." McKinnon! The name was a thunderclap in the quiet room. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. "The man I was supposed to marry. His name was James McKinnon." Thomas went pale. The air in the room grew thick, charged with a sudden, terrifying connection. This wasn't a coincidence. This was something else entirely. The man who had abandoned her was somehow tied to the death of this family's mother, and she was now trapped in the very house his shadow haunted. The revelation changed everything. The Hale Ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was the heart of a mystery. Thomas became even more withdrawn, the wall of grief now reinforced with suspicion. He watched Eliza, his eyes filled with a new, unsettling question. Who was she really? This woman who appeared on the same day his wife's killer was supposed to? Margaret's coldness sharpened into open hostility. She saw Eliza not as a healer, but as a harbinger of death, a woman connected to the very name that had destroyed their family. Eliza felt like a prisoner. She was trapped by circumstance, by the innocent love of a child, and by a growing, terrifying suspicion that James McKinnon hadn't just abandoned her. He had lured her here for a reason. The letter she carried, the ones she had read 100 times, now felt different in her hands. The kind words, the promises of a new life. Were they a lie or a code? She began to search for answers in the only place she could, Sarah Hale's belongings. Margaret had packed them away in a small wooden trunk in the attic. One afternoon, while Margaret was in town and Thomas was out on the range, Eliza forced the lock. Inside, beneath folded dresses that still smelled faintly of lavender, she found a small, leather-bound journal. Sarah Hale's handwriting was a delicate, looping script. The early entries were filled with the simple joys of a rancher's wife. The birth of Annie, the price of cattle, prayers for rain. But the tone of the last few entries, dated just before her death, was different. It was laced with fear. September 12th. J.M. came by again today. He is a charming man, but his eyes are cold. He speaks of partnership, of the railroad buying up land. Thomas does not trust him. He says J.M.'s promises are built on sand. J.M. James McKinnon. September 19th. McKinnon is pressuring Thomas to sell the northern pasture. He says the railroad needs the water rights from our creek. Thomas refused. The argument was terrible. McKinnon threatened us. He said people who stand in the way of progress have a habit of disappearing. September 25th. I followed McKinnon today. I know I shouldn't have, but I saw him meeting with another man near the old cottonwoods. It was Mr. Abernathy from the bank. They were exchanging papers. I heard Abernathy say, The Hale land will be ours one way or another. The forged deed is ready. A forged deed, a conspiracy. Sarah had uncovered a plot to steal their land, and she had paid for it with her life. Eliza's hands were trembling as she read the final frantic entry. October 2nd. I am sick. The fever came on so fast. Just after I drank the water from the canteen McKinnon offered me on the trail. Thomas thinks it's the mountain fever, but I know. It's poison. He has murdered me. If anyone finds this, tell Thomas the truth. The deed is a lie. Protect Annie. Protect our home. Poison, not a fever. Sarah Hale had been murdered, and James McKinnon, the man who had promised to marry Eliza, was her killer. He hadn't abandoned Eliza at the station. He hadn't shown up because he was already dead. Someone had silenced him before he could be tied to Sarah's death. Eliza slammed the journal shut, her mind reeling. She wasn't just a mail-order bride caught in a tragic misunderstanding. She was the last living link to a murdered woman and a conspiracy to steal this very ranch. And the killers didn't know that she was here. Or did they? A floorboard creaked behind her. Eliza whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. Margaret stood in the attic doorway, her face a mask of cold fury. In her hand, she held a heavy iron skillet. You shouldn't have read that, Margaret whispered, her eyes glittering with a chilling light. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. The attic was suffocatingly hot, the air thick with the smell of dust and old secrets. Margaret took a step forward, the iron skillet held like a weapon. Eliza's mind raced. You knew, she breathed. You knew Sarah was murdered. I knew she was asking questions that were going to get us all killed, Margaret hissed. This land, it was supposed to go to my late husband. He and McKinnon had a deal, a partnership. Sarah found out. She was going to ruin everything. The confession was a slap in the face. Margaret wasn't just a cold woman. She was a co-conspirator. You let your brother believe his wife died of a fever, Eliza said, horrified. Grief is better than a bullet, Margaret sneered. Thomas is a good man, but he's not a fighter. He would have gone to the sheriff. He would have gotten himself killed, and we would have lost everything. I did what I had to do to protect this family, to protect Annie. She took another step. McKinnon was a loose end. After Sarah died, he got greedy. He wanted it all. So I arranged for him to have an accident, and I made sure his mail-order bride never showed up. Or so I thought. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Margaret had killed McKinnon. Margaret was the one who poisoned Sarah. But Annie got sick, Eliza said, stalling for time, backing away toward the small attic window, with the same fever. Margaret's face faltered for a second. That was a mistake. I never meant for the child to drink from that well. The poison was meant for you. The day you arrived, I knew you were a threat. Suddenly, a shout came from downstairs. Margaret! Eliza! Where are you? It was Thomas. He was home early. Margaret's eyes darted toward the sound, a flicker of panic in her expression. In that split second of distraction, Eliza acted. She threw Sarah's heavy journal at Margaret's head and scrambled for the attic ladder. Margaret screamed in rage, swinging the skillet. It glanced off Eliza's shoulder, sending a searing pain down her arm. Eliza tumbled down the ladder, landing in a heap on the second-floor landing. Thomas was running up the stairs. What in God's name is going on? She knows, Margaret shrieked from the attic. She knows everything. Thomas saw the wild look in Eliza's eyes, the journal lying open on the attic floor, and the truth, or some horrifying version of it, seemed to dawn on his face. Margaret, what have you done? He whispered. Margaret appeared at the top of the ladder, her face contorted with desperation. I did it for us, Thomas, to protect our home. Just then, Annie's small voice piped up from the bottom of the stairs. Auntie Margaret, why are you trying to hurt Mama Liza? Seeing the child, Margaret seemed to snap. She let out a guttural cry and lunged down the ladder, the skillet raised high. But Thomas was there. He moved with a speed Eliza had never seen, placing himself between his sister and his wife. He caught Margaret's arm, the skillet clattering to the floor. They struggled. A tangle of limbs and a lifetime of shared history turned toxic. She was going to take it all away, Margaret screamed, clawing at his face. The house that had held so much silent grief now echoed with violence. Downstairs, Annie began to cry. The sound of his daughter's fear seemed to break through Thomas's shock. With a powerful shove, he pushed Margaret away from him. She stumbled backward, lost her footing at the top of the stairs, and fell. Her body tumbled down the steep staircase, landing in a twisted heap at the bottom. Silence. Thomas stared down at his sister's still form, his chest heaving. Eliza rushed past him, her own pain forgotten, and ran to a sobbing Annie, scooping the child into her arms. "It's okay," she whispered, rocking the terrified girl. "It's over." But it wasn't over. As Thomas slowly descended the stairs, his face ashen, he knelt beside Margaret. He checked for a pulse, his hand trembling. He looked up at Eliza, his eyes hollow. "She's gone," he said. The truth was finally out. But it had come at a terrible price. They had traded secrets for blood, and as the sun set over the Hale Ranch, casting long, bloody shadows across the floor, they were left with the wreckage of their family, and the chilling realization that Mr. Abernathy, the banker, was still out there. And he knew Eliza was the last person who could expose his fraudulent claim to their land. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Thomas buried his sister in the small family plot on the hill, his face a mask of stone. The truth had shattered him. He had lost his wife to his sister's greed, and now his sister to his own hands. Eliza did her best to hold the fragile remnants of their family together. She cared for Annie, who had grown quiet and watchful, the trauma of what she'd witnessed stealing her childish laughter. They were no longer just a grieving family. They were survivors of a war fought within their own walls, and the enemy was still out there. Eliza knew Abernathy would not let things lie. He had invested too much in the scheme to steal the Hale Ranch. With McKinnon and Margaret dead, Eliza was the only one left who knew about the forged deed. She was a loose end. She saw his men in town. They didn't try to hide. They sat on the porch of the saloon, their eyes following her every move when she went for supplies. It was a message, a threat. "We have to go to the sheriff," Eliza told Thomas one night, her voice low and urgent. Thomas just shook his head, his eyes empty. "The sheriff is Abernathy's man. He plays cards with him every Tuesday. There's no one we can trust." He was right. They were on their own. The ranch, once a symbol of hope and belonging, had become a fortress, a prison. One evening, as dusk settled over the prairie, Thomas found Eliza in the barn, cleaning a rifle with steady, determined hands. "You've fought wolves before," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is different," she replied, not looking up. "Wolves are honest about their hunger." He watched her for a long moment. He saw the woman who had nursed his daughter back to health, the woman who had stood by him in the face of death, the woman who was now preparing to defend his home. The emptiness in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of the man he used to be, a man who protected his own. "Give me that," he said, taking the rifle from her. "I'll stand watch tonight. You get some rest." His words were a promise. He was done hiding in his grief. He was ready to fight. The attack came just before dawn. 3 riders, their faces masked by the gloom. They didn't ride in shooting. They were silent, creeping toward the house like shadows. But Thomas was waiting. The first shot from his rifle cracked through the pre-dawn silence, and one of the shadows fell. The other 2 scattered, returning fire. Bullets thudded into the walls of the house. Inside, Eliza grabbed another rifle and took up a position at the window. Annie huddled behind her. The gunfight was short and brutal. Thomas and Eliza fought with the desperate courage of people with everything to lose. When the sun finally rose, the yard was silent again. 2 of Abernathy's men lay dead. The third had fled. They knew he would be back, and he wouldn't come with just 2 men next time. That afternoon, a lone rider approached the ranch. It was the sheriff. He dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun. "Heard there was some trouble out here, Hale," he said, his eyes scanning the scene. "Just some coyotes getting too bold," Thomas replied, his voice hard as iron. The sheriff's eyes lingered on the fresh graves Thomas had been forced to dig. He looked at Eliza, standing on the porch with a rifle in her arms. He looked at Thomas, a man transformed by violence and a renewed purpose. He chewed on his lip for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, you let me know if those coyotes come back." He mounted his horse and rode away without another word. He was Abernathy's man, yes, but he was also a man who knew a losing fight when he saw one. He wasn't going to die for a banker's greed. That night, as they sat around the fire, Thomas reached across the table and took Eliza's hand. "You came here as a mail-order bride, looking for a home," he said, his voice rough with emotion. I never imagined you'd be the one to save it." "We saved it together," she whispered. A few weeks later, word came from Cheyenne. The bank owned by Mr. Abernathy had suddenly and mysteriously burned to the ground. All records, including deeds and loans, were destroyed. In the chaos, Abernathy had vanished. Some said he'd fled with what money he could carry. Others whispered he'd met the same fate as his hired guns. No one ever knew for sure. The threat was gone. The Hale Ranch was safe. Life settled into a new rhythm, a peaceful one. The ghosts of the past began to fade, replaced by the promise of the future. That spring, Eliza felt the first flutter of new life inside her. When she told Thomas, he swept her up in his arms, his laughter echoing across the prairie. Annie danced around them, shouting that she was finally going to be a big sister. 9 months later, a son was born, a boy with Thomas's steady eyes and Eliza's auburn hair. As Eliza held her newborn son, with Annie leaning against her shoulder and Thomas's hand resting on hers, she looked around the small room. This house had seen so much sorrow, so much violence, but it had also seen incredible courage and a love that had been forged in fire. She had come to Wyoming looking for a husband. Instead, she had found a war. But in fighting that war, she had found something far more precious: a family, a home, and a love strong enough to outlast any storm. What a journey of love, loss, and the incredible strength it takes to build a family on the frontier. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and let me know your favorite part in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of survival and second chances. Thanks for watching.